Hi everyone, my name is Nicole DeRisi and welcome to my undergraduate poster presentation. My study is titled Academic Attitudes and Stress Among Rutgers University Students. My study is about how perfectionism affects the mental health of university students. And historically, perfectionism has been researched and studied in its contribution to psychological disorders such as depression, anxiety, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder. But rather than viewing it through a clinical lens, I wanted to study how perfectionism affects a non-clinical population, such as university students, in particular undergraduates. It has been studied in American honors students, in adolescent students in high school, middle school, Australian, Canadian, and Chinese college students, but not in non-honors undergraduate American university students. And most populations that have been studied have been predominantly Caucasian samples. So here at Rutgers University, we have a diverse student population. So we were able to employ many students of many backgrounds into this study. So it's a more representative sample. And in particular, my study focuses on depression, anxiety, and stress as measures of mental health. And we wanted to see what about perfectionism causes effects on mental health. And in order to do so, we had to look at perfectionism and how it's been conceptualized over the years in research. And researchers have conceptualized perfectionism as a multidimensional trait that one can possess. And this trait has 4 dimensions. One is concern over mistakes and doubts about actions. This dimension is kind of what you typically would assume a perfectionist is. So someone who is constantly concerned if their work is good enough, doubting themselves because the work isn't perfect or up to their standards. They kind of present to have a helplessness orientation. So if something's not perfect or they make one mistake, they think they're just a complete failure and they're done. And if they're not perfect at something immediately, they just are uninterested and they doubt themselves, they concern themselves, and like one mistake that will equate to failure. So it's a very extreme perfectionist. Um, and then we have parental expectations and parental criticism. That is one dimension itself as well. And that is perfectionists who are affected by what their parents think of them and the high standards that they hold for their children and how critical they are of their children and their academic success. And then we have personal standards. So this is the very driven perfectionist, the one that has high goals, high standards, and they want to succeed. And they often have a mastery orientation. So they will try and work as hard as they can to reach a goal, no matter how hard the obstacle is, because they're focused on the success and the end goal. And they have very high personal standards, as you would assume, because that's in the word personal standards. Um, and it's basically like the highly motivated perfectionist who needs things to be perfect and up to par with their standards. They're often their own worst enemy because they feel like everything needs to be perfect, and if it's not, then they need to work harder and harder and harder. And then organization is how organized someone is, how orderly their work is, if they have good time management, stuff like that. That dimension is not really important in this study. We're going to focus on concern over mistakes and doubts about actions, parental expectations and parental criticism, and personal standards. Because in the survey I used, which was the Frost multidimensional perfectionism scale, they noted that organization isn't really a big contributor to the overall perfectionism score, and it doesn't really contribute to mental health at all. And you'll see later when I ran the correlational analyses, it wasn't really correlated with much. It was kind of just a variable that was there, so I figured it wasn't really important to include. But as I said, with all these 4 dimensions, we would like to see which dimension yields different effects and their individual effects on mental health. And Another question is, how can these perfectionistic students combat their depression, anxiety, and stress that can be brought on by their perfectionism? And through this study, by identifying which dimensions contribute the most to emotional distress, we can have counseling be more targeted. So if we notice it's one dimension more than the others, certain characteristics of that dimension can be treated using cognitive behavioral therapy, for example. Um, but before we go into the method, I just wanted to state my hypotheses alongside with these beginning questions. So my first hypothesis was that individuals who score high on the concern over mistakes and doubts about actions dimension or subscale are going to have higher anxiety, stress, and depression scores due to like their helplessness orientation, how hard they are on themselves, and their black and white thinking. It's like, if I'm not perfect, then I'm a failure. If I make one mistake, then I failed the whole thing. So I think they have more depression, anxiety, and stress. And then those who have high parental expectations and parental criticism, I hypothesized would have higher stress levels and anxiety and depression levels because of the weight their parents are holding on them on their shoulders. And then for personal standards, I hypothesized quite the opposite of the previous two dimensions. I thought that they would have lower depression, anxiety, and stress scores, being that they're very self-motivated and they can see the end goal, they can see the light at the end of the tunnel, so they're willing to get through the struggle and work hard. They may face stress, but I think that their end goal kind of outweighs the stress that they're currently facing. So I don't think that we'll have as high depression, anxiety, and stress scores as the previous two dimensions because they have a mastery orientation. They're very motivated and they have high personal standards and they're not willing to not reach their goals essentially. So while it may be stressful, I think the outcomes of having high personal standards are good. So it will be less likely to lead to depression and anxiety because you'll be more likely to succeed. Otherwise, if you keep beating yourself up, like we see in concern over mistakes and doubts about actions, of course, you're going to feel depressed and anxious because nothing feels good enough and you feel like you're not reaching your goals. So those were my main hypotheses. And we're going to move along to the methods now. So in order to test these hypotheses, we had 864 Rutgers undergraduate students take two questionnaires, which was the Frost Multidimensional Perfectionism Scale, which includes the 4 dimensions I'm talking about. And then we had them take the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale. And the procedure was they signed up for the survey online through Sona and they gave their consent. And once the consent was given, they were redirected to the online survey, which contained the 2. They took the FMPS first and the DAS 21 second. And once they completed it, they received their research credits. And over here, we have the results. So I made this little table, and on the left side, we have the Pearson correlation coefficients for each subscale correlated with one another. So you can see that certain subscales go hand in hand. When someone is scores highly in one subscale or dimension, they tend to also score high in another subscale or dimension because they are interrelated. So we can see with concern over mistakes and doubts about actions, it's highly correlated with parental expectations and parental criticism, which makes a lot of sense. So you're stressed about your parents' expectations and demands. And so you're constantly worried if your work is going to live up to their expectations, if it's good enough. And then we also see that CMDA, concern over mistakes and doubts about actions, is highly correlated with personal standards, which again, that does make sense because someone who has high personal standards and wants to reach their goals that they set for themselves, they want their work to be perfect and up to par. And if it doesn't seem perfect, of course, they're going to be concerned and they're going to work hard and fix it. And they're going to, be concerned over their failures because essentially they don't want to fail. And then we have parental expectations and parental criticism, again, correlated with CMDA. And it is not as much correlated with personal standards. It's pretty low in comparison to the others, which makes sense because if your parents are the main people that are concerned with your success rather than you, why would you have high personal standards if it's all external influence? So if your parents are the ones concerned about your success and you're not the one concerned, of course, you're not going to have high personal standards. You're just going to be doing whatever your parents want you to do, not really what you're driven yourself to do. It's external influences, as I said before. So of course, personal standards isn't going to be highly correlated with parental expectations and parental criticism because the parents are the outside influence and you don't really have any other motivations or goals besides to just appease your parents. And then as we see again, personal standards is highly correlated with concern over mistakes and doubts about actions, which I explained what that meant before. And then if we move over, we could see the mean scores for each dimension / subscale, and then the standard deviations. And then these are the beta weights. I did multiple regression analysis. And so we can see that this is depression, anxiety, and stress. For CMDA, over all three of these, it has the highest beta score. And for depression, there was a significant regression equation found for the model containing all three dimensions or subscales, CMDA, PAPC, and PS. And the R squared was 0.279, so 27.9% of the variance can be explained by those three variables. But if you look at the beta weights, most of it comes from CMDA. So it accounts for the highest variance, essentially. And we see the same thing for anxiety. It's an R squared value of 0.251, and it's the model containing all three dimensions again. So it explains 25.1% of the variance. But again, CMDA holds the highest beta level. And then we have the same thing for stress. This is the highest. So we have an R squared of 0.323, which is 32.3%. So essentially, CMDA accounts for the highest variance in depression, anxiety, and stress scores. Personal standards may serve as a buffer against both depression and anxiety, because what we see here is it's a negative right here. So the person's score on the subscale, their individual score, would be multiplied by negative 0.156 and negative 0.062. So that means that their levels will go down, their depression anxiety levels, when they have higher personal standards. So it serves as a buffer against depression and anxiety. However, it does not do the same for stress, which does make sense because when you have higher personal standards, you're stressed to meet your goals and you need everything to be up to your goals. So you're going to be more stressed. So it does serve as a buffer against depression and anxiety. However, it does not carry onto stress. And we see here that parental expectations and parental criticism doesn't really do much. It does take away some stress, but very insignificant amount. And then CMDA, as I said before, is the most important and accounts for the most variance. So every time in depression, for example, the person's score on CMDA, the subscale, would be multiplied by 0.524, I'm sorry. And that's a lot. As same here, 0.491 and 0.558, where when you compare to these, very low numbers. So although I use the models containing all three dimensions, we could see that through these beta weights, CMDA accounts for the most variance, and it's the strongest. And then in general, we can see that perfectionism predicts stress more than anxiety and depression, because for all of these, it accounts for 32.3% of the variance, which is the highest, the one with the lowest residual. And so in conclusion, the key findings of my research indicate that concern over mistakes and doubts about actions is a robust predictor of depression, anxiety, and stress. Personal standards serves as a buffer against depression and anxiety, which we could see here. And then parental expectations and parental criticism, as well as personal standards, do not have a strong influence on stress, which you can see here. Once again, CMDA is the highest. These results strongly imply that those who engage highly in concern over mistakes and doubts about actions may benefit from counseling, such as stress management, and cognitive behavioral therapy in particular can be used to challenge the doubtful and black and white pattern of thinking. Those who engage in personal standards have a mastery orientation, good coping skills, and positive affect. Those with high personal standards do not tend to give up in the face of challenging tasks and situations, further emphasizing their mastery orientation. And those who engage in the dimension concern over mistakes and doubts about actions often respond to difficult situations with a helplessness orientation as a result of their black and white or all or nothing thinking. So that was it. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation. And in conclusion, I would say that perfectionism indeed affects the mental health of university students, whether that be depression, anxiety, and stress. It's more so stress, but you can see that it does affect depression and anxiety as well. Thank you, and I hope to answer some questions in the live Q&A.